The first thing that hit them was the smell, even before the blast wave arrived. From the open cockpit, the night air carried up the sharp sting of burning cordite, mingled with the oily reek of diesel and the dry, sweet tang of splintered pine. Nadia felt it roll over her face like a physical thing, the wind pressing the scent into her skin as she banked the little biplane away from the burning horizon. Below, somewhere in that boiling orange glow, the German ammunition depot was coming apart in a chain of explosions that stitched across the earth like a row of volcanic mouths tearing open one after the other, each detonation hurling up a dirty fountain of fire and black shrapnel. The shock waves thumped against the fabric-covered wings of her Polikarpov Po-2, making the old wood creak and the control cables hum under her gloved fingers. Irina twisted slightly in the rear cockpit, her silhouette barely visible as a darker shape against the flicker of the inferno. She had to shout to be heard over the roar of the fire and the wind. "Secondaries! Look at the secondaries!" she cried, her voice breaking with a mixture of exhaustion and disbelief. They stacked them too close together. Idiots. Nadia did not answer, her jaw clenched so tight it hurt, her eyes tracking one rising column of flame after another as the blast from an underground magazine punched a mushroom of incandescent dust into the night sky. The Germans on the ground looked like ants around a kicked nest, tiny dark figures running between burning buildings, some staggering, some simply disappearing when a storage shed went up in a white flash that lit the undersides of the clouds. Anti-aircraft guns barked blindly into the darkness, their tracers searching empty air. The witches had long since slipped away from the cones of the searchlights. Farther out, beyond the reach of the flames, more shadows crossed the stars, fragile black shapes that flickered briefly against the moonlit clouds and then were gone. 8, 9, 10 of them, gliding silently on dead engines before each small plane relit its heart with a cough of gasoline and flame. Nadia could almost picture their faces, even at this distance. Lena's narrow, fox-like grin as she lined up her run, Katya's forehead furrowed in concentration as she checked her luminous compass with one hand and held the bomb release cable with the other. They would have seen the first detonations, felt the heat on their cheeks as they slid over the target fence at treetop height, and known that the work of the night was no longer delicate or uncertain. It was now a matter of feeding more sparks into a bonfire that had finally caught. On the ground, Hauptmann Ernst Müller of the Wehrmacht Supply Services dropped to his knees as a blast wave tore through the depot yard. The air was full of a sound like a giant tearing sheet metal apart, and for a moment he could not tell whether it was outside or inside his own skull. The map table he had been standing over flew sideways, charts scattering like autumn leaves. Someone crashed into him in the smoke, their uniform hot with radiant heat, and he smelled singed wool and burned hair. "Sir, the northern magazines," the voice choked, swallowed by another detonation from the direction of the rail sidings. That would be the high-explosive shells, he realized dimly, the ones they had been carefully husbanding for the counter-offensive that was supposed to begin in a few days. The offensive that depended on this depot like a heart depended on blood. Out beyond the collapsing sheds and twisted rail cars, beyond the frantic silhouettes of men trying to drag crates away from the spreading flames, the Russians' little gnats still buzzed at the edge of hearing. Ernst had laughed at them earlier that year, listening to Frontline reports of Soviet women in flying coffins, of biplanes cobbled together from wood and fabric and sent out into the dark like swarms of mosquitoes. Night witches, the infantrymen called them, half amused, half superstitious, and the staff officers in their polished boots had smirked at the idea of being threatened by such things. But tonight, as the sky above his sector burned and the ammo dumps that should never have been vulnerable erupted one after another, the faint drone of a tiny engine in the distance was enough to make his stomach fold in on itself, a primitive, animal reaction to a new kind of fear. Hours before the first depot had exploded, the world had been quiet in the little clearing that served as the regiment's forward field. It was the kind of quiet only the front could produce. Not peace, but the tense pause between storms, full of distant thuds and the faint, unfriendly rumble of artillery somewhere far away. Frost still clung to the grass in a brittle white lace that crunched under boots. Nadia had stood beside her Po-2, running her gloved fingers along the leading edge of the wing, feeling the bumps in the stretched fabric where patches had been nailed over flak damage. The plane looked more like a children's toy than a weapon, with its thin struts and spindly landing gear, its open cockpits and the stubby radial engine that dripped oil onto the frozen ground. She had been 19 when she arrived at the regiment, trading textbooks and lecture halls for the smell of gasoline and the taste of fear that never fully left the back of her throat. Back then, in the winter of 1942, the war had already chewed up many of her illusions, but not all. The reality of the front had stripped away the posters and slogans and replaced them with something raw: muddy boots, endless drills, the weight of bombs in trembling hands. The first time she had seen her new aircraft, she had laughed slightly, unable to help herself. "We're going to fight the Luftwaffe in these?" she had whispered to Irina, who was already there, a stick-thin girl from Leningrad with serious eyes and ink stains on her fingers from the slide rule she carried even into the field. The male officers had laughed too, though with a different edge. At the training school, they had watched the women line up on the parade ground with amused detachment, muttering that this was a political experiment, a propaganda stunt, something the party had dreamed up to show the world that the Soviet woman could do anything. Let them have their little airplanes, one colonel had said, hands clasped behind his back as he walked along the line. They will be useful for courier work, dropping leaflets, maybe harassing a trench or two. The Germans will not even waste fuel climbing to shoot them down. When Nadia and the others had been told that their unit would be flying only at night, that their planes were too slow, too fragile, too defenseless to survive the daylight, they had felt the sting behind the order. It meant they were not good enough for the heroic dogfights that filled the newspapers. They were being sent into the dark like ghosts, unseen and unsung. The Germans, for their part, had been told little more. Reports came in from battered infantry units about tiny aircraft flitting over their lines at night, cutting their engines and gliding in near silence before dropping small bombs on bivouacs and supply points. At first, the staff officers at Corps and Army headquarters dismissed these as exaggerations or nervous fantasies. When the reports persisted, a note was added to the intelligence summaries. Soviet female bomber unit operating in sector. Planes are obsolete trainers. Threat level, minimal. Generals made jokes during briefings, mockingly referring to the witches who might disturb their sleep. One even bet a bottle of French cognac that they would shoot down 3 of the little pests with handheld machine guns before the week was out. What none of them saw was the world inside the regiment's tents and dugouts. The scraped knuckles and bruised shoulders from hauling the bombs by hand because there wasn't enough ground crew. The endless arguments over navigation data, scribbled by lantern light. The way the cold seeped into bones during long briefings and only left when the adrenaline took over on final approach to a target. On a night that still tasted of winter, months before the ammo depot burned, Nadia had sat hunched over a rough map with Irina and their squadron commander, Yekaterina, tracing lines with a stub of pencil. The map was already creased and stained with coffee, its rivers and contours half obscured where someone had wiped away mud. "The depot is here," Yekaterina said, tapping a point near a rail junction, her gloved finger leaving a little print on the paper. "It's not just ammo. There's fuel, spare parts, and they've concentrated their artillery shells there for the push they're planning. The reconnaissance boys say they have light flak in a ring around the perimeter, and heavier guns near the rail line. Searchlights, too. They know it's important." "Then they know we'll come," Irina murmured. Her voice was always low, the tone of someone who had spent her life in libraries and laboratories where loudness was an affront. She recalculated the distances under her breath, the numbers a soft litany that ran parallel to the drumbeat of distant guns. "They think we can't touch it," Yekaterina replied, looking from one young face to the other. Her eyes had that tired, burning look that came from too many nights without enough sleep. "They think our little biplanes are good for harassing their line at best. The regimental artillery lads say it's suicide to go after something that heavily defended. The brass in the rear would rather we keep annoying the frontline trenches. They don't like us gambling their political experiment on big targets." Nadia knew what she wasn't saying. If the raid failed badly enough, if they lost too many planes and too many girls in one blow, the skeptics would have their proof. They would say the women were brave but impractical, courageous but too fragile for serious work. They would retreat to the safer notion that war, real war, belonged to men with their heavy machines and their comfortable certainties. And yet, the depot sat on that map like a pulsing sore, a node where German arrogance and logistical vulnerability intersected. To leave it untouched felt like betrayal. The first attempt had almost proven the skeptics right. They had come in too high, too cautious, spooked by the forest of tracers that climbed toward them the moment they crossed into the outer ring of defenses. Searchlights lashed across the sky, their white beams cutting through the thin mist and making the biplanes look like flies trapped in an enormous jar. Nadia remembered the way her heart had hammered in her throat as she saw one of their aircraft suddenly blossom into a brief, awful flower of orange and black, its burning pieces trailing downward. They dropped their bombs on secondary targets that night, setting a fuel dump on the edge of the complex alight, but leaving the main magazines untouched. When they turned for home, the depot still loomed in the darkness behind them, mostly intact, only a few licks of flame marking where they had scratched its skin. Back at the field, the mood had been brittle. No one spoke much as they peeled off their leather helmets with stiff fingers, tossing them onto benches and crates. One of the ground crew, a young man with grease permanently ground into his hands, made the mistake of saying that at least they had come back. "That's something, isn't it? At least you're alive." Yekaterina had looked at him with a coldness that cut deeper than any shouted reprimand. "We don't fly," she said quietly, "to come back with our bombs still hanging under the wings. We fly to make something burn." The next day she was called to divisional headquarters to explain the losses, sitting in a room that smelled of cigarette smoke and bureaucracy, while a gray-haired colonel leafed through reports and shook his head. "The depot is too heavily defended," he said, as if explaining something to a stubborn child. "We have other aircraft for that. Fast ones with armor. You girls are valuable for what you do best. Harassment, keeping them awake. You're good mosquitoes. Don't try to be eagles." The word girls landed like an insult. Yekaterina kept her face impassive, her hands folded neatly in her lap, but when she came back that evening and told the others what had been decided, Nadia saw the muscle in her jaw twitch. They were to focus on ammunition trucks, smaller dumps, fuel tanks at the edge of the front. The depot itself would be left for another day, another unit, and yet the map stayed pinned to the wall of their planning tent, its corners curling with damp. Every time Nadia glanced at it, the little red circle around the depot seemed brighter, as if drawn in fresh blood. The German generals continued to joke. In headquarters rooms lit by lamps shielded with green glass, they moved little flags across maps of their own, red arrows sweeping forward into planned offensives that depended on precise timetables and steady flows of supplies. When a junior officer mentioned the recent raid on the depot, minor damage, a few fuel barrels lost, no significant disruption, the corps commander waved it away with a flick of his hand. "From those women?" he said with a faint smirk. "If they had wanted to hit us, they would have. Maybe they became frightened and turned away. They can frighten the infantry with their noise and their little bombs. This," he tapped the symbol for the depot, "is the nerve center of an operation. It is not for bedtime stories." Laughter moved around the table. Someone chimed in with a crude remark about witches and brooms. The planning continued. That arrogance clung to the depot like a shield. It allowed the Germans to stack shells and crates of powder closer together than they should have, to cut corners on dispersal and camouflage in the interest of efficiency. It allowed them to believe that the thin, distant whine of approaching engines at night was an annoyance, not a mortal threat. It allowed them to underestimate, again and again, what desperation and imagination could do when given a flimsy biplane and a black sky. Inside the regiment, the decision to return to the depot took shape in whispers, and in the clink of spoons on tin cups filled with weak tea. "We can't hit it like the others do," Irina said one evening, her breath fogging in the cold air of the dugout as she sketched patterns on a scrap of paper. "We can't come in high and make one big run. We have to behave like—" She searched for the word, chewing on her lip. "Like smoke, like fog. We seep in, we touch everything, and by the time they realize what's happening, it's already everywhere." They studied German flak patterns, past reports from other sectors, photographs taken by reconnaissance flights that showed the depot from above. Neat rows of warehouses, long stacks of crates, rail lines running like veins into the heart of the complex. From that vantage point, it looked orderly, almost serene. But they knew, those girls with their calloused hands and sleepless eyes, that inside each of those boxes and barrels was potential energy waiting to be set free with just the right nudge. The plan that emerged was not the kind military textbooks favor. There would be no single, decisive blow, no massive formation of bombers appearing all at once. Instead, the regiment would turn the night itself into a weapon. They would fly in small groups, hours apart, sometimes singly, sometimes in pairs, sometimes in fours, altering their approach routes each time. They would kill their engines and glide when within reach of the searchlights, dropping low enough that the branches of trees might scratch their wings. They would drop light bombs first, aiming for fuel storage and the thinner roofs of shell sheds to start fires, then follow up with heavier loads targeted at the burning areas where the heat would weaken structures and hasten the spread. It was less a bombing raid than a slow, deliberate poisoning. The first night of the new campaign, the moon was a thin, hesitant crescent, barely enough to silver the tops of clouds. Nadia and Irina climbed into their wobbly little plane under the sputtering glow of a single lantern, its light carefully hooded. The ground crew loaded bombs by hand, 2 men at a time grunting under the weight as they lifted them onto the racks. Nadia felt each impact as the metal settled into place, the whole airframe shuddering slightly with the addition of every new burden. Her breath smoked in the air, and her fingers ached even through the gloves as she tightened her harness straps. Out by the edge of the field, someone Someone coughed, the sound startlingly loud in the large silence before engines came alive. When the motor finally coughed and caught, the familiar buzzing roar filled the world, vibrating through her spine. She taxied along the rough strip, bumping over ruts and frozen clods of dirt, eyes fixed on the dim outline of a comrade's plane ahead. There was no romanticism in this part of the work, no music, just the physical sensation of acceleration, the jolt and scrape of wheels leaving ground, the sudden lightness as the little aircraft clawed its way into the air. Earth fell away, and with it went the warmth of the lanterns and the smell of fuel-soaked rags. Ahead lay only the dark. In that dark, irrelevancies dropped away. There was only the damp sting of cold air on cheeks, the glow of the tiny instruments, the faint light of the stars when clouds allowed. Irina's head was a shadow in the rear cockpit, bent over her navigation notes. Occasionally, she would tap Nadia's shoulder and raise a hand, fingers spread, a signal for minor corrections in course. They spoke little. The wind stole words before they could fully form. Instead, they communicated through small touches, glances, the tension or relaxation of shoulders. The German depot was a distant idea at first, a point on a mental map that grew slowly more real as they passed landmarks. A ribbon of river faintly visible where moonlight broke through the overcast, the jagged silhouette of a ruined village, its shattered church steeple poking at the sky. By the time Irina tapped twice and held up 3 fingers, a sign that they were 3 kilometers out, Nadia's body had become an instrument of its own, attuned to every vibration in the airframe, every subtle shift in the wind. She cut the throttle when Irina squeezed her arm twice. The sudden loss of engine noise was like being plunged underwater. Only the rush of wind remained, a low, constant whooshing that made the rigging sing faintly. The glide felt both peaceful and terrifying. Without the engine's growl, she could hear more of the world below, the occasional crack of a rifle shot, the distant rumble of trucks, and as they came closer, the mechanical clank of something large in motion. The depot emerged from the darkness gradually, a patch of deeper shadow, then a cluster of dim lights, then a complex of shapes and spaces where those lights had been carefully shielded. The first night, they dropped their bombs on the fuel tanks at the far edge of the complex, as planned. Small explosions, little blossoms of flame that lit the nearest rows of crates. The flak guns woke up in response, tracers weaving erratic paths through the sky well above where the night witches had been. By the time the Germans brought the searchlights to bear, the little biplanes were already drifting away, engines still silent, slipping back into the protective cloak of the night. It was a pinprick, a small sting, barely enough to make a staff officer frown over his morning reports. But it was a beginning. Night after night, they returned. Sometimes Nadia flew. Sometimes she stayed on the ground, helping the maintenance crew patch holes in others' planes, fingers numb as she held fabric taut while someone else hammered in the nails. There were nights when the weather nearly canceled the mission. Low clouds that threatened to erase the world, sleet that became ice on exposed skin. But the orders came anyway, and the little biplanes went up, staggering into the sky with their loads of fragmentation bombs and incendiaries. The Germans reacted, of course. More searchlights, more guns, more bursts of tracers that stitched the air with deadly light. They shifted their flak patterns, creating zones of concentrated fire where they guessed the witches would come. But the regiment adjusted in turn, sending single planes at odd hours, changing approach headings, pretending to withdraw, and then circling back low over the treetops. Irina experimented with timing, trying to find the exact window between the end of one searchlight sweep and the beginning of the next. Sometimes their calculations brought them through untouched. Sometimes, luck added its own cruel arithmetic. They lost Lena on a moonless night, when the sky felt deep enough to swallow them whole. Her plane took a hit just as she opened up into the glide, a burst of flak tearing away a chunk of wing. The aircraft rolled strangely, its silhouette twisting in the narrow beam of a searchlight before it fell out of sight. No parachutes opened. Back at the field, there was an empty bunk, a pilot's helmet left on a nail, a cup of tea growing cold on a table. They said her name softly, then swallowed it, tucking the grief into the same inner pocket where they kept their fear. There was no room for either in the cockpit. By the time the depot's garrison realized that what they were facing was not random harassment, but a deliberate campaign, the complexion of their nights had changed. Sleep became fragmented, broken into nervous segments between the distant drone of engines and the moment when someone's shout of "Flieger alarm" sent men scrambling out of their cots. Some began to flinch at every gust of wind rattling the corrugated roofs of the sheds. Others smoked endlessly, the glow of their cigarettes tiny red stars in the darkness as they stared toward the tree line. The officers demanded more guns, more manpower, more discipline, but what they could not demand was rest. And through it all, in some comfortable room farther back, a general still chuckled over the idea of toy biplanes, flown by girls, being the source of their unease. He did not see the thin faces in the mirror each morning, the way his own staff flinched at unexpected sounds. He only saw the statistics on paper and the reassuring words of subordinates who did not want to be associated with the idea that witches from the sky were making their soldiers jump at shadows. The night it all came together began like many others. A briefing by lantern light, the smell of damp earth and kerosene, the clink of spoons against chipped bowls of soup eaten too quickly. But there was an added tension in the air, a density to the silence after Yekaterina finished outlining the plan. They were going to gamble everything they had learned, every scrap of understanding about flak rhythms and searchlight habits, on a concentrated series of strikes over a single extended night. Not one sortie, not two, but a succession of waves that would begin at dusk and not end until the sky in the east began to pale. "We know their patterns now," she said, her voice low but steady. "We know where their heavy guns point and how fast they swing. We know where their ammunition is densest. The recon boys confirmed what we suspected. They've brought in more shells and packed them tight. They want their offensive. They think we're a nuisance. Tonight, we prove we're a disaster." There were no speeches about glory, no stirring slogans, just the practical details of timing and altitude, the reinforcement of targets, fuel first, to set the stage, then the lighter shell stores, to create sympathetic detonations. Finally, if the fires burned hot enough, the main magazines, where the big stockpiles of artillery ammunition waited under thick roofs that would weaken in the heat. Nadia listened, her fingers tight around a pencil she was not using, feeling the familiar mixture of fear and something else, something like hunger. They took off in staggered groups. Nadia's plane was in the second wave, scheduled to hit a particular cluster of storage buildings once the fires from the first passes had taken hold. As she climbed into the cockpit, the night pressed close around her, full of unspoken farewells. On the edge of hearing, someone hummed a snatch of a song from home. The ground under her boots was damp, the mud stiffening with the first touches of frost. She inhaled the smell of fuel deeply, as if trying to commit it to memory, then swung herself into the seat and pulled the goggles down over her eyes. The flight out felt shorter than it had on the earlier nights, though the clock would have argued otherwise. Adrenaline compresses time. Landmarks flashed beneath them. The river, the ruined village, a patch of forest that looked like a darker bruise on the land. Irina touched her shoulder once, twice, then held her hand flat, on course. The engine thrummed steadily, a mechanical heartbeat. When Irina's fingers closed around her arm again and squeezed 3 times, Nadia knew what was coming. She closed the throttle and felt the engine die under her palm. Silence burst outward, immense. The nose dipped slightly as the plane slipped into its glide path. Ahead, the horizon glowed faintly orange. This was new. Usually, the depot was just a smudge of shadow until they were almost on top of it. Tonight, fires already crawled over part of its surface, spread by the first wave. Columns of smoke rose into the night like black trees. The glow painted the undersides of the clouds, turning them into bruised, luminous sheets. Closer now, and she could see individual tongues of flame licking at the edges of roofs. A row of fuel drums was already a writhing line of orange, heat distortion making the air around them shimmer. Somewhere within that chaos, flak guns were barking, their muzzle flashes intermittent and frantic. Tracer fire stitched the sky well above her, the gunners overcompensating, expecting faster targets. With her engine off and her altitude low, she was all but invisible, just another shadow skimming over a landscape of fire and panic. Left, 2 degrees, Irina's voice came faintly, carried over the wind. Nadia nudged the stick. The target they had chosen was a cluster of long sheds near the rail line, where reconnaissance photos had shown neat rows of crates. The heat from the burning fuel depot nearby was already rippling across their roofs, making the corrugated metal shine like wet skin. Nadia's fingers tightened on the bomb release cable. She could feel the weight of the bombs under the wings, feel the plane's reluctance to respond as quickly as usual. They were so low now that she could see individual figures on the ground, running between the buildings, some carrying buckets, others simply dashing for open space. A searchlight beam swung clumsily across the sky behind them, narrowly missing another Po-2 that ghosted by like a black leaf. Nadia pulled the nose up slightly, judging distance with a practiced eye. The world narrowed to a tunnel, the glow of the sheds, the faint reflection of firelight on rail tracks, the darkness beyond. "Now," Irina said. Nadia yanked the cable. The plane leapt upward, suddenly lighter as the bombs dropped away. She did not watch them fall, did not even have time to say a half-formed prayer. The need now was escape. She shoved the nose down, skimming low along the line of warehouses, feeling the heat on her face, the air buffeting her with pockets of rising hot wind. The first explosion came a heartbeat later, a dull thump that rolled through the airframe, then another, sharper, then a series, each one brighter than the last, as the bombs found their mark and the flames licked deeper into the depot's heart. The shockwave hit them like a giant hand, tossing the little plane up and sideways. Nadia fought it, muscles straining, teeth bared in a grimace the darkness could not see. Splinters of something, wood, metal, she could not say, whipped past them. One hit the underside of the wing with a dull, murderous sound, but the fabric held. The glow behind them intensified, turning their shadows on the clouds into stark silhouettes for a moment, before they slid out of the immediate blast radius. They were not done. As they clawed for slightly higher altitude, engine roaring back to life, Nadia saw other Po-2s arriving, their fragile shapes ducking and weaving through the flak. They came in from multiple angles, some cutting their engines early and drifting in like falling leaves, others keeping some power on for maneuverability and taking their chances with the gunners. Each dropped a small payload, insignificant on its own. Here, a line of incendiaries fanned out across a stack of crates. There, a cluster of fragmentation bombs tore through a group of hastily constructed revetments. The fires jumped and multiplied, fed by fresh sparks. On the ground, Hauptmann Müller's world had become a vision from some medieval hell. The air was thick with smoke and flying debris, lit from within by the constant pulsing flames of secondary explosions. His carefully laid out depot was now a landscape of craters and burning rubble. The neat rows of shells had turned into lethal projectiles once the fires reached them, each one contributing its own violent punctuation to the night's chaos. Men lay where they had been thrown, some motionless, others writhing and screaming, their voices almost drowned by the roar. He saw one of the little planes overhead at last, just for a moment. A spindly silhouette framed against a curtain of fire as it banked away. It looked impossibly fragile, like something a child might assemble from scraps. For a second, something like disbelief rose in him. This is what is doing this to us? But disbelief turned quickly to a colder realization. The defense structures he had trusted, the distances and altitudes he had considered safe, were all calibrated for different enemies. Fast metal monsters, not these ghostly intruders slipping under the radar of his assumptions. He stumbled toward a subaltern who was yelling into a field telephone, trying to make himself heard over the din. "Tell them," Müller shouted hoarsely, gripping the man's sleeve. "Tell them the depot is compromised. Tell them we will not be able to meet." His words were cut off by another blast nearby. The ground jumped. When it settled again, the telephone was a blackened scrap, the subaltern's face a mask of raw red where something had stripped away the outer layer of skin. Müller's ears rang. In the distance, more engines droned, then dimmed as the witches cut their throttles again for another run. The night stretched on, elastic and unforgiving. For the women of the regiment, it became a blur of takeoffs and landings, of numb fingers fumbling with harnesses, of ground crew loading more bombs by the light of flickering lanterns, while their teeth chattered in the cold. The smell of burning powder clung to their clothes, carried back from the target on currents of air. They drank tea that had gone lukewarm and did not taste it. Faces were streaked with soot, eyes made larger by exhaustion. Between sorties, Nadia sat on an overturned crate, hands still trembling, and stared at the dark shape of her plane. Irina crouched beside her, checking the crude repairs a mechanic had just slapped over a new bullet hole. "It's holding," she said, half to herself. "It'll hold for one more." Nadia nodded, though the thought of climbing back into that cockpit made her stomach tighten. Yet each time the call went up, she stood, pulled her helmet back on, and returned to the sky. The knowledge of what was happening at the depot lent a terrible energy to their movements. This was no longer harassment, this was excision. When the blackness above the eastern horizon finally began to thin, turning first to charcoal, then to deep blue, the glow from the direction of the depot had not faded. If anything, it had spread, a low, continuous glare that painted the undersides of clouds in dirty orange and sent a faint, persistent smoke smell drifting all the way to the Night Witch's field. The last returning craft landed in a gray half-light, wheels throwing up spray from the damp ground. Engines sputtered and died. Silence, sudden and vast, settled over the clearing, broken only by the ticking of cooling metal and the distant animal roar of something still burning far away. They gathered near the operations tent, too tired even to fully stand at attention. Yekaterina looked like someone carved from wax left too near a fire, features melted by lack of sleep, shoulders slumped. Yet her eyes were sharp as she listened to the hasty reports, marking off which targets had been hit, which planes had taken damage, who had not come back. When she announced the final tally, there was no cheer, just a quiet, collective exhalation. They had lost 3 planes, 6 women. But the depot, the last reconnaissance photographs came in by radio, she said, voice rough. They might as well have sent us a picture of the moon. The whole area is just light. They say the fires are visible from 30 kilometers away. The ammo dumps went, all of them. The rail lines are twisted like string. The divisional artillery chief sent his regards. He says their offensive timetable is now, how did he put it? She squinted, trying to recall. In the hands of God and the witches. The words rippled through the group, eliciting a few tired smiles. Someone from the ground crew let out a low whistle. Nadia felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been coiled there since the first time she had seen the depot circled on a map. Lena's face rose unbidden in her mind. She imagined her comrade seeing the inferno from wherever she was, lips quirking in that fox-like grin. "We did it, little mosquito," she murmured under her breath. Back behind German lines, in a headquarters now suddenly cut off from promised resources, the tone of conversations about the Night Witches changed. No longer were they spoken of only as curiosities, anecdotes to enliven an otherwise dry briefing. Now they appeared in stark lists of threats, their unit designation underlined on intelligence summaries, their capabilities reassessed. The general who had once joked about shooting them down with handguns found himself explaining to his superiors how a regiment of toy planes had managed to cripple a key logistical node under his responsibility. His words were careful, his palms damp. "It is their method," he said, tracing circles on a map with a shaking finger. "They do not attack as our bombers do. They come again and again, from angles we did not anticipate. Their slowness allows them to hug the terrain. They glide to the target without engines. Our searchlights look too high. Our guns point at where the enemy should be, not where they are. They exploit the seams in our doctrine." He did not say the other part aloud. Their part, that their presence had begun to wear at the nerves of his men in a way that extended beyond the physical damage they inflicted, that the sound of an approaching engine at night now made even experienced soldiers flinch, that rumors of ghostly women pilots had begun to spread, embroidered with fear. Stories grew in the telling. German infantrymen swapped tales in trenches and dugouts about the witches who flew without engines, who could see in the dark, whose biplanes were made from the wood of coffins and the fabric of shrouds. Every soldier knew, rationally, that these were just young women in primitive aircraft, but reason was a thin shield at 3 in the morning, when the earth around you shook from explosions you could not predict, and the sky seemed full of invisible wings. In that fragile hour, arrogance withered, replaced by a more primal respect. In the Soviet camp, respect came more slowly and in different forms. The same colonel who had once told Yekaterina that her unit was good for harassment work and not much else, now came in person to visit the field. His boots picked up mud just like everyone else's. He walked past the patched-together planes, the stacks of bombs, the dark circles where fires had been lit to keep fingers from freezing. The women watched him with guarded expressions as he approached the operations tent. He spoke for several minutes, offering thanks on behalf of higher commands, mentioning decorations that would be recommended, citing the impact on the enemy's plans. His words were stiff, the vocabulary of someone more used to reprimands than praise. Yet there was a new tone underneath, grudging at first, then more open, acknowledgement. When he finished, there was an awkward pause. Then, unexpectedly, he reached out and ran his gloved hand along the wing of one of the Po-2s, brushing the rough fabric as if seeing it for the first time. "I used to train cadets on machines like this," he said quietly, half to himself. "We thought their war was over. It seems it was only beginning." The women did not suddenly become celebrities. They did not receive better boots, or warmer blankets, or an extra hour of sleep. The war went on, demanding their labor and their courage every night. They moved forward as the front shifted, flying from fields that were sometimes little more than widened forest roads, landing in ruts and mud. The loss of the depot did not end the German ability to fight. The Reich was too vast, its industrial machine too entrenched, but in that sector, for that crucial period, something fundamental had been altered. German artillery units that were supposed to open the offensive with massive barrages found themselves rationing shells. The carefully synchronized timetable of attacks and counterattacks collapsed into a scramble of improvisation. Some units went into battle supported only by half the firepower they had been promised. Others had to delay operations entirely, while new supplies were rerouted over longer, more vulnerable lines. On Soviet maps, the bright red arrows marking planned advances could now be drawn with a little more confidence. For Nadia, Irina, and the others, the greatest change was internal. They had walked into this war carrying an invisible weight, the knowledge that many in their own side considered them symbols first and soldiers second, useful as propaganda but not fully trusted as instruments of strategy. The burning of the ammo dumps did not erase that entirely, but it cracked it. Each time they flew after that night, they did so knowing that somewhere, in heated discussions far above their heads, their unit's name would be invoked not as a curiosity, but as a proven asset. They remained, to the end, the same strange mixture they had been at the beginning. Young women who sometimes braided each other's hair and shared stories of the lives they might have had, and hardened aviators who could run their fingers along a damaged wing and tell, by feel, whether the plane would survive another sortie. They laughed, they cried, they wrote letters home when they could. The ink sometimes blotched where hands shook. The war aged them quickly. Yet every time someone, Soviet, German, or anyone else, referred to them dismissively. The memory of the depot burning till dawn stood ready as a silent answer. Years later, when the war was over and the world had begun to repave its ruins and plant flowers on old battlefields, the story of the Night Witches drifted into that liminal space between history and legend. Official records noted their sorties and their tonnage of bombs dropped. Some of them received medals, their names read out in formal ceremonies where uniforms were neatly pressed and the air smelled of peacetime. Others faded into quieter lives, carrying the sound of night winds and exploding depots with them into factories, classrooms, and kitchens. In Germany, former soldiers told their grandchildren about the nights when the sky buzzed with unseen wings and the world shook under them for reasons they could not control. Some embellished, adding ghostly details, because that is what people do when trying to make sense of fear. In the Soviet Union, and later in the countries that rose from its collapse, the story was retold in books, films, and whispered anecdotes, each retelling polished one facet or another, but the core remained. Women in toy planes had turned arrogance into ash. If one could stand now on the site of that old depot, there would be little left to see. The craters would have long since filled with water or earth. Grass would grow where the stacks of shells once stood. The rail lines would be rusted or gone. Only the ground would remember, in some deep, mute way, the night when it convulsed under the force of exploding magazines, while the sky above shivered with the shadows of slow, stubborn aircraft that refused to behave as anyone had predicted. And if a person standing there in the quiet wind listened very carefully, past the rustle of leaves and the murmur of distant traffic, they might imagine, just for a moment, that they heard it again. The fading whine of a small engine, the sigh of fabric wings, and the almost inaudible laugh of someone who had been underestimated one time too many. In that imagined echo lies the true revenge of the Night Witches. They did more than burn ammunition dumps and derail offensives. They punctured the conceit that war could be neatly categorized, that only certain kinds of bodies and machines belonged in its most dangerous realms. Every time a German general scoffed at their existence and then had to redraw his supply maps because of what they had done, every time a Soviet officer who saw them as a political experiment had to admit that their calculations had been wrong, a small piece of that old arrogance crumbled. The fires that rose from the depot on that long, terrible night eventually died down. The glow faded from the clouds, the smoke dispersed into the atmosphere, and the world spun onward. But for the women who flew through that inferno in open cockpits, with their faces numb from cold and heat in the same breath, and for the men on the ground who watched their carefully hoarded shells erupt into uncontrolled chaos, the memory did not dim. It burned, steady and persistent, like a pilot light inside them. And somewhere, in that space where night and history overlap, the Night Witches are still flying, silhouettes against a curtain of flame, cutting their engines at the edge of the roar to let the wind carry them the last, deadly distance. The generals who mocked them cannot reach them there. Their laughter was light and brief. The witches' work, and the fear it inspired, lasted until dawn and far beyond.